The air in the Apostolic Palace dining hall, thick with the scent of roasted pheasant and aged barolo, shimmered under the crystal chandeliers. Cardinal Valerius, his scarlet cappa magna spread wide like a predatory bird's wings, swept his hand dismissively towards the far corner. A faint scuff mark, no larger than a thumbprint, marred the pristine marble floor near a gilded Baroque cabinet. It was barely visible to the casual eye, a ghost of an imperfection. Yet, to the cardinal it was an affront, a desecration. He fixed his gaze on Matteo, the elderly janitor who stood hunched near the service entrance, his worn overalls a stark contrast to the silken vestments and military uniforms that filled the grand room. Matteo had been diligently polishing the base of a particularly ornate bust of Pope Pius V just moments before, his movements slow and methodical, the product of decades of quiet labor within these sacred walls. His face, a roadmap of gentle wrinkles, flushed with a mixture of fatigue and the sudden, uncomfortable glare of the cardinal's disapproval. "Matteo, is it not?" Cardinal Valerius's voice, usually a booming instrument designed for cathedral acoustics, lowered to a cutting whisper that still carried across the hushed room, making the delicate clinking of silverware momentarily cease. Such negligence in this hallowed space on such an auspicious occasion. The arrival of the delegation from Ravenna, no less. One would think a man of your experience would understand the gravity of cleanliness here. Monsignor Alaric, a younger cleric whose ambition shone brighter than his polished spectacles, smirked beside the cardinal, adjusting his own silk cuff. He shot a glance towards the newly arrived delegation, clearly signaling that this was an example of the Vatican's rigorous standards, a performative display of order and discipline. Matteo's eyes dropped to the floor, his shoulders slumping further as several junior priests snickered, their faces hidden behind their wine glasses. He stammered a soft apology, barely audible above the low hum of conversation that cautiously resumed, a sound like a tide returning after a brief, unnatural pause. Pope Leo XIV, seated at the head of the immense mahogany table, a vision in his simple white cassock, had been observing the scene. His expression, often described as serene, held a subtle, unreadable quality. He had been quietly listening to the Bishop of Genoa expound on the intricate details of a new diocese boundary dispute, but his peripheral vision had caught the cardinal's theatrical gesture, the janitor's immediate shrinking form. A flicker, almost imperceptible, passed through the Pope's ancient blue eyes. It was not anger, nor immediate judgment, but something deeper, akin to a quiet sorrow. Cardinal Valerius expected the Pope to nod, perhaps offer a silent endorsement of the swift reprimand, or, at the very least, remain neutral, allowing the minor disciplinary action to unfold without interruption. After all, maintaining decorum and hierarchy was paramount in the Vatican, and minor staff were easily overlooked, their presence taken for granted, their dignity often secondary to the smooth functioning of the grand machinery. The Pope, however, had always been a man underestimated by those who mistook his gentle demeanor for weakness, his quiet contemplation for indecision. The Bishop of Genoa droned on, oblivious, detailing statistical population shifts and the canonical implications. Pope Leo XIV raised a hand, a gesture of polite but firm interruption. The bishop, mid-sentence, blinked, his narrative suddenly truncated. A ripple of curiosity went through the room. The Pope's gaze swept across the array of silver platters, the intricate floral arrangements, the faces of cardinals, archbishops, and diplomats, their eyes now fixed on him. His voice, when he spoke, was soft, yet it carried an undeniable authority that silenced the room completely. "My dear friends," he began, his words resonating with a quiet power that seemed to absorb the very light from the chandeliers, "I confess, the true delicacy of this evening seems to have eluded us thus far." A faint murmur of confusion rippled through the guests. Had the pheasant been undercooked? Was the wine somehow flawed? Valerius, feeling a momentary apprehension, shifted in his seat, his earlier triumph over Matteo momentarily forgotten in the face of this unexpected papal address. The Pope paused, his gaze settling briefly on the still hunched figure of Matteo before returning to the assembled dignitaries. "I find myself pondering the true meaning of sustenance," he continued, his tone reflective. Is it merely the food on our plates, however exquisitely prepared? Or is it something more profound, something that nourishes not just the body, but the very soul? He allowed the question to hang in the air, a silken thread of thought suspending the collective breath of the room. Monsignor Alaric exchanged a quick, perplexed glance with a nearby bishop, a silent question passing between them. What cryptic pronouncements was His Holiness about to deliver now? The Pope then slowly pushed back his chair, the subtle scraping sound echoing in the sudden silence. Every eye in the vast hall followed his movement. He rose, his tall, slender frame commanding attention without any overt effort. The Bishop of Genoa, still holding his fork midair, looked utterly bewildered. Therefore, Pope Leo XIV stated, his voice gaining a clear, resonant quality, "I find I cannot partake of this lavish repast." A collective gasp, barely audible, swept through the hall. Faces shifted from confusion to shock, then to thinly veiled alarm. Cardinal Valerius's face, moments before etched with smug satisfaction, paled visibly. His meticulously planned evening, meant to impress the Ravenna delegation and showcase Vatican discipline, was crumbling before his eyes. Indeed, the Pope continued, his gaze unwavering as it met Valerius's startled eyes, "I believe I shall seek my nourishment elsewhere tonight, with a companion more reflective of the simple grace I feel drawn to." He took a step away from the table, his eyes once more finding Matteo, who had straightened slightly, his old eyes wide with disbelief, not daring to believe what his ears were telling him. "Matteo," the Pope called out, his voice gentle but firm enough to cut through the bewildered murmuring that had begun to rise. "Would you do me the honor of sharing a meal this evening?" The janitor froze, his hand still clutching a polishing cloth. He looked around the room as if expecting the Pope's words to be directed at someone else, someone more important, more worthy of such an invitation. The silence that followed was so profound, one could almost hear the individual beats of hearts in the room. This was not merely a break in protocol, it was an earthquake, a seismic shift in the rigid fault lines of Vatican hierarchy. A Pope, the Vicar of Christ, publicly choosing the lowliest servant over the most esteemed prelates, the most powerful diplomats. The cameras, though none were present in the hall, would have been rolling, capturing every stunned face, every dropped jaw. Cardinal Valerius finally found his voice, a strangled whisper. "Your Holiness, with all due respect, this is unprecedented. The protocol, the delegation, their expectations." He gestured vaguely at the table laden with untouched food, then at the Ravenna delegates who sat frozen, their expressions a mixture of shock and bewildered curiosity. Pope Leo XIV turned fully to face the cardinal, his expression serene, unyielding. "And perhaps, Cardinal, it is precisely because it is unprecedented that it is necessary." He then took a step towards Matteo, his robe swishing softly against the marble. "Matteo, please lead the way, to wherever you usually take your evening meal." The elderly janitor, his face still a mixture of bewilderment and a dawning, fragile hope, slowly nodded. He fumbled for a moment, then began to shuffle towards a discreet service door, his gait still burdened by years of labor, but now imbued with a faint, almost imperceptible lightness. As the Pope began to follow Matteo, his form moving with a quiet dignity towards the unassuming service door, the entire hall remained locked in a stunned silence. It was as if the very air had solidified, trapping the collective breath of the cardinals, bishops, and diplomats. No one dared to move, no one dared to speak. Their expressions ranged from open-mouthed shock to tight-lipped disapproval, a silent cacophony of offended tradition and bewildered hierarchy. Cardinal Valerius, his face now a mottled red, looked as if he had swallowed a bitter pill. His eyes darted nervously between the retreating figure of the Pope and the equally stunned Ravenna delegation. This was a direct, public challenge to his authority, to the very fabric of the order he so zealously upheld. Monsignor Alaric, usually so quick with a cutting remark, could only manage a slow, involuntary shake of his head, his ambitious mind struggling to process such a radical, almost unthinkable, departure from the norm. The Pope and Matteo passed through the heavy, unmarked service door, its dull wood a stark contrast to the gleaming mahogany of the dining hall. They stepped into a dimly lit, utilitarian corridor, the air here carrying the faint scent of disinfectant and stale cooking oil, a stark olfactory counterpoint to the perfumed opulence they had just left. Matteo, still slightly dazed, shuffled along, his worn shoes squeaking softly on the linoleum floor. He glanced back, as if expecting the Pope to reappear, to declare it all a mistake, a whimsical jest. But Pope Leo XIV walked beside him with a quiet grace, his white cassock a beacon in the muted light of the service passage. His steps were even, unhurried, reflecting a profound sense of purpose. He looked at Matteo with a genuine warmth in his eyes, a depth of compassion that seemed to cut through the janitor's decades of invisibility. "Tell me, Matteo," the Pope's voice was low, conversational, stripped of all formality, "where do you find solace in these vast halls when the day's work is done?" Matteo, surprised by the direct, personal question, cleared his throat. There's a small canteen, Your Holiness, down the winding stairs past the laundry rooms. It's not much, but the soup is warm." His words were hesitant, almost apologetic, as if he felt ashamed to lead the Holy Father to such humble quarters. The Pope simply smiled, a genuine, unhurried smile that reached his eyes and softened the lines around them. "Warm soup and good company, Matteo, are far more valuable than the grandest banquet without heart." He placed a light, reassuring hand on Matteo's shoulder, a gesture that seemed to physically lift some of the janitor's long-held burden of obscurity. Meanwhile, back in the grand dining hall, the frozen tableau began to thaw into a chaotic murmur. Cardinal Valerius, recovering his composure, though his face remained flushed, began to address the Ravenna delegation with strained cheerfulness. "A momentary spiritual reflection by His Holiness, I assure you. A unique form of contemplative fasting, perhaps. We shall proceed, of course. The exquisite pheasant awaits." His words, however, lacked conviction, sounding hollow in the cavernous room now echoing with the absence of the Pope. Monsignor Alaric, more pragmatic, was already discreetly excusing himself, his mind buzzing with the implications. This was not just a minor incident. It was a narrative, a story that would spread like wildfire through the Vatican and beyond. And he, Alaric, needed to be at the forefront of shaping that narrative, or at least observing its trajectory to position himself advantageously. The news, as Monsignor Alaric had predicted, spread like wildfire. Within hours, hushed whispers had turned into fervent discussions, then into public statements and condemnations from various conservative factions within the church. The traditionalists were aghast. A pope dining with a janitor in the staff canteen. It was an insult to the Holy See, a disregard for millennia of sacred hierarchy, a dangerous precedent that threatened to undermine the very structure of the Church. Cardinal Valerius, having composed himself, issued a terse, carefully worded statement through his press office, emphasizing the Pope's unique spiritual journey and assuring the faithful that protocol remained inviolable and that the incident was merely an eccentric but deeply personal act of humility. His words, however, rang hollow even to his own ears. As the Pope and Matteo descended the narrow, unadorned staircase that led to the staff canteen, the sound of clattering dishes and boisterous chatter grew louder. The contrast with the hushed opulence they had left was jarring. The canteen was a simple, brightly lit room with sturdy wooden tables and plastic chairs. A large television mounted on the wall silently displayed a news channel, its flickering images of geopolitical events ignored by the small group of staff members, cooks, cleaners, maintenance workers who were finishing their late-night meals. They looked up, startled, as the Pope and Matteo entered. Forks clattered onto plates, conversations died, and a profound silence, born of pure disbelief, settled over the room. A young cook, wiping her hands on her apron, nearly dropped a tray of clean mugs. Matteo, still leading the way, found a small, empty table in a corner. He pulled out a chair for the Pope, then for himself, his movements now a little more assured, a faint pride dawning in his eyes. Pope Leo XIV sat down, his white cassock a brilliant splash against the utilitarian backdrop, seemingly perfectly at ease. He looked around the room, acknowledging the stunned staff with a gentle nod and a small, warm smile. "Good evening to you all," he said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard over the hum of the refrigerator. "May I join you for a simple meal?" A middle-aged cleaner, still holding a broom, stammered, "Your Holiness, of course, but we only have vegetable soup and stale bread." Her voice was filled with a mixture of awe and mortification. "Perfect," the Pope replied, his smile widening. "The simpler the fare, often the richer the experience." He turned to Matteo. "So Matteo, tell me about this famous vegetable soup. Is it truly as warm as you promised?" Matteo chuckled, a soft, reedy sound that seemed to break the tension in the room. He walked to the serving counter, his steps lighter than they had been in years, and returned with 2 steaming bowls of thick, fragrant vegetable soup and a basket of slightly hardened bread. He placed one bowl in front of the Pope, his hand trembling slightly. The Pope picked up his spoon, dipped it into the soup, and took a slow, appreciative mouthful. "Exquisite," he declared, his eyes closing for a moment in quiet pleasure. "Truly a dish fit for kings, or rather for brothers." As they ate, the Pope engaged Matteo in quiet conversation. He asked about Matteo's family, his life before the Vatican, his earliest memories of working in the palace. Matteo, initially hesitant, slowly opened up, sharing stories of his youth in a small village outside Perugia, his joy at seeing his grandchildren, the quiet satisfaction he found in bringing order to the grand, ancient spaces of the Holy See. He spoke of his wife, long past, and the small garden he tended on the outskirts of Rome. The Pope listened intently, nodding, offering small, empathetic interjections. His questions were not perfunctory. They were genuinely curious, reflecting a profound interest in the janitor's lived experience, an understanding that Matteo's life, though outwardly humble, held its own rich tapestry of joy, sorrow, and quiet dignity. The other staff in the canteen, initially frozen in their surprise, slowly resumed their meals, their gazes occasionally drifting towards the corner table, their faces softened by awe. They watched as the Pope, the most powerful spiritual leader in the world, laughed gently at one of Matteo's anecdotes about a particularly stubborn stain, and listened with rapt attention to the stories of his family. Back in the grand dining hall, the forced cheerfulness of Cardinal Valerius had begun to fray. The Ravenna delegation, though outwardly polite, seemed distracted, their eyes constantly flicking towards the service door through which the Pope had exited. The pheasant, once glorious, now lay congealing on the platters, an expensive monument to a disrupted evening. Monsignor Alaric, having made a few discreet phone calls, returned to the dining hall with a grim expression. "Your Eminence," he whispered to Valerius, bending close, "the news is already spreading beyond the Vatican walls. The wires are buzzing. Pope dines with Janitor. It's a sensation. And not, I fear, in the way we might prefer." Valerius's hand instinctively tightened around his wine glass, his knuckles turning white. This was worse than he had imagined. This was not just an internal disruption. This was a public relations disaster, a potential weakening of papal authority in the eyes of the world, all for the sake of a common laborer. The conversation between Pope Leo XIV and Matteo continued for what felt like an eternity and a fleeting moment all at once. The Pope spoke of the weight of expectation, the quiet burden of leadership, and how true insight often came from the most unexpected places. He shared a story from his own youth, a time when he had served as a humble parish priest in a forgotten village, learning profound lessons from the unwavering faith of a simple farmer. Matteo listened, captivated, his own long-held assumptions about the unreachable distance between himself and the Holy Father crumbling with each passing minute. The Pope revealed a vulnerability, a human frailty that belied his lofty title, and in doing so, forged an unspoken connection of shared humanity. He asked Matteo about the challenges of his work, the long hours, the often thankless nature of maintaining the Vatican's immense historical collections. Matteo spoke of the aching in his joints, the loneliness that sometimes crept in during the quiet, late-night hours, but also of the profound sense of peace he felt when the halls were empty, and he was alone with the history and the silence. "You see, Matteo," the Pope mused, stirring the last remnants of his soup, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from the bowl. "The Church in its essence is not defined by its grandeur, its gilded ceilings, or its ancient protocols. These are but earthly vestments, noble and necessary perhaps, but ultimately superficial. The true church, the body of Christ, is found in the dignity of each soul, in the selfless service, in the quiet acts of kindness that so often go unseen, unheard, uncelebrated. He lifted his gaze, meeting Matteo's eyes directly. You, my dear Matteo, in your daily labor, in your dedication to maintaining the cleanliness and order of these sacred spaces, you are a living testament to that quiet, profound dignity. You are a cornerstone as much as any cardinal or bishop. Matteo's eyes welled up, tears blurring his vision. He had never been spoken to with such reverence, such genuine appreciation in his entire life. The words, simple yet profound, resonated deep within his weary soul, affirming a lifetime of quiet service that had often felt invisible. The other staff members in the canteen, initially silent observers, slowly began to relax, their curiosity overriding their awe. They witnessed the Pope's genuine engagement, his unforced humility. A young cook, emboldened, approached the table with a plate of freshly baked biscotti. Your Holiness, if you would permit my grandmother's recipe. The Pope smiled warmly. A blessing, my child. Please sit with us. Soon, the small corner table was surrounded by a small, impromptu gathering of Vatican staff, sharing stories, laughter, and the simple warmth of human connection. The atmosphere shifted, transforming from a sterile staff canteen into a space of unexpected communion. A microcosm of the Church, the Pope envisioned one built on shared humanity, not rigid hierarchy. This was the transformation the Pope sought, not just for himself, but for those around him. Back in the main dining hall, Cardinal Valerius, his face a mask of barely contained fury, finally dismissed the Ravenna delegation with strained pleasantries. He summoned Monsignor Alaric to his private chambers immediately. This cannot stand, Alaric, Valerius thundered, pacing his opulent office, his scarlet robes rustling impatiently. This stunt undermines everything we stand for. It sends a message of chaos, of disrespect for tradition, for the very authority of the papacy. Alaric, ever the pragmatist, steepled his fingers. Indeed, Your Eminence, the progressive media are already hailing it as a revolutionary act of humility. The traditionalists are in uproar. The Holy Father, it seems, has inadvertently ignited a theological and political firestorm. Valerius stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing. Inadvertently? I doubt that, Alaric. Leo XIV is far shrewder than he appears. This was no accident. This was a deliberate statement, and we must respond, publicly, and with theological weight. The next morning, the Vatican buzzed with an unprecedented energy. The story of the Pope and the Janitor had not only spread through the international wires, but had gone viral on social media platforms, amplified by cell phone videos secretly taken by quick-thinking staff in the canteen. News channels debated the meaning of the Pope's actions. Some hailed him as a revolutionary figure, a true shepherd attuned to the struggles of the common man. Others, particularly conservative commentators, condemned it as a dangerous dereliction of duty, an embrace of secular populism that threatened the ancient dignity of the Holy See. A segment on a prominent global news network showed a split screen. On one side, an image of the opulent papal dining hall, untouched food gleaming under grand chandeliers. On the other, a grainy, shaky video of Pope Leo XIV in his simple white cassock, sharing a laugh with Matteo over a bowl of soup in the stark, unadorned staff canteen. The visual juxtaposition was devastatingly effective, making Valerius's carefully crafted narrative about a spiritual reflection seem absurdly out of touch. Cardinal Valerius, still smarting from the public humiliation, decided to strike back. During a televised morning homily in St. Peter's Basilica, ostensibly on the importance of order and discipline within the Church, he delivered a thinly veiled critique of the Pope's actions. His voice, usually a booming instrument, took on a tone of mournful gravitas. There are those, he intoned, his gaze sweeping across the rows of faithful, then subtly lingering on the empty papal throne, who, in their pursuit of an idealized humility, risk dismantling the very structures that have preserved our sacred faith for millennia. We must remember that true leadership requires not just compassion, but wisdom. a wisdom that understands the importance of upholding tradition, of maintaining the divine order, lest the flock be scattered and the very foundations of the church be eroded by fleeting sentiment. Monsignor Alaric, observing from the side aisle, nodded approvingly. It was a masterful, indirect attack, cloaked in theological language, designed to sow doubt about the Pope's judgment without directly accusing him. The Pope, however, remained outwardly unfazed. He spent the morning in quiet contemplation, reviewing his schedule for the day, which included an unexpected visit to the Vatican gardens. As he walked through the meticulously manicured pathways, his gaze fell upon a small, often overlooked section dedicated to medicinal herbs, tended by a solitary lay gardener. The gardener, a man named Benedetto, whose hands were gnarled and stained from years of working the soil, looked up, surprised to see the Pope. Pope Leo XIV stopped, his attention drawn to a patch of vibrant purple lavender. "Beautiful, Benedetto," he murmured, kneeling slightly to touch the fragrant leaves. Each leaf, each flower serving its purpose. Yet, how often do we overlook the quiet miracle of their growth, focusing instead on the grand spectacles? Benedetto simply nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. Later that afternoon, during a private meeting with the College of Cardinals, the air in the Sistine Chapel, usually heavy with solemnity, was thick with unspoken tension. Cardinal Valerius, emboldened by his morning homily, took the opportunity to address the recent, unusual occurrences directly. He spoke of the need for prudence and pastoral wisdom in all papal actions, subtly implying that the Pope's dining with Matteo lacked both. "Your Holiness," Valerius began, his voice carefully modulated, "while we commend your spirit of humility, there is concern that such an unprecedented act, however well-intentioned, may send a message of disregard for the established order, for the very dignity that protects the Holy See from the clamor of the secular world." He paused, allowing his words to sink in, his eyes fixed on the Pope, expecting a defense, a justification. Pope Leo XIV listened patiently, his hands clasped before him, his gaze calm and unwavering. He allowed Valerius to finish, his silence amplified by the sacred space around them. When the cardinal concluded, a heavy quiet descended. Every cardinal present leaned forward, anticipating the Pope's response. Would he rebuke Valerius? Would he offer a contrite explanation? But what he said next stunned the entire studio. Had there been cameras rolling, every cameraman would have zoomed in, every sound engineer would have strained to catch the faintest whisper. "Cardinal Valerius," the Pope began, his voice soft, almost conversational, yet it resonated with an undeniable clarity that filled the vast chapel. "You speak of dignity, of order, of tradition, and indeed, these are vital pillars. But tell me, Eminence, where does true dignity reside? Is it in the trappings of power, the splendor of ceremony, the adherence to rules for rules' sake? Or is it in the recognition of the divine spark within every human being, regardless of their station, their title, their visibility?" He paused, allowing the question to hang in the air, a silken thread weaving through the silence. Valerius shifted uncomfortably, his carefully prepared arguments suddenly feeling flimsy in the face of the Pope's direct, unadorned query. Monsignor Alaric, observing from the back, felt a prickle of unease. This was not the defensive posture he had anticipated. "I believe, Your Holiness," Valerius finally stammered, "that dignity is inherent to the sacred office, to the venerable traditions passed down through the ages." The Pope nodded slowly. "Indeed. And yet if those traditions blind us to the suffering of a single soul, if they cause us to overlook the inherent worth of a brother, a son of God, simply because his hands are calloused and his clothes are plain, then are those traditions truly serving their divine purpose?" He turned his gaze, sweeping it across the faces of all the cardinals, his blue eyes piercing, yet filled with profound sadness. "Are we then truly upholding the dignity of Christ himself, who chose to walk among the humble, to break bread with outcasts, to wash the feet of his disciples?" The atmosphere in the Sistine Chapel shifted. The air, once thick with tension, now hummed with a different kind of energy, one of uncomfortable introspection. The Pope had deftly turned the tables, not with anger but with a quiet, persistent logic, weaving a theological argument that was difficult to counter. He was not rejecting tradition. He was recontextualizing it, elevating the spirit of the law above its rigid letter. He continued, his voice steady. When I saw Matteo, a man who has devoted decades to keeping these sacred spaces clean, to allowing their beauty to shine forth for all who enter, when I saw him diminished, publicly shamed for a minor imperfection that was perhaps not even his fault, I saw not a janitor. I saw Christ himself in the least of his brethren. He paused, then dropped a line no one saw coming, his voice resonating with an almost prophetic tone. And it occurred to me then that the true scandal is not a pope breaking bread with a humble servant, but a church that might allow its own servants to be broken by its pride. A stunned silence descended upon the Sistine Chapel. The cardinals, many of whom had felt a surge of indignation at the pope's actions, now found themselves grappling with the profound implications of his words. Pope Leo XIV had not merely defended his actions, he had elevated them to a theological imperative, challenging the very moral fabric of their perceived righteousness. Cardinal Valerius, his face pale, opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. He looked around, seeing the averted gazes of his fellow cardinals, the slight nods of some younger bishops who had been silently watching the exchange. Monsignor Alaric, who had been discreetly taking notes, felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The Pope had not raised his voice, not resorted to harsh words, yet he had utterly dismantled the cardinal's position, exposing its spiritual emptiness with a quiet, devastating grace. This was not a power struggle in the conventional sense, it was a spiritual reckoning. The reverberations of the Pope's statement in the Sistine Chapel spread quickly throughout the Vatican, and then, through leaks and whispers, to the wider world. The narrative shifted decisively. What had initially been painted as a chaotic break from tradition by some conservative factions was now increasingly seen as a profound act of Christ-like humility and moral courage. Pope Leo XIV began to incorporate the theme of dignity in labor and the sanctity of the unseen into his subsequent homilies and addresses, not as a direct response to the controversy, but as an organic extension of his ongoing theological reflections. He spoke of the hands that built the cathedrals, the quiet prayers offered by countless anonymous faithful, the selfless service of those who sustain the machinery of the Church from its very foundations. Each message was carefully crafted, not to condemn, but to illuminate, to gently guide the faithful back to the core tenets of their belief. Cardinal Valerius, finding himself increasingly isolated in his rigid stance, felt the pressure mount. The public backlash against his subtle criticisms intensified, with many interpreting his words as cold and out of touch. The Ravenna delegation, still in Rome, made a point of requesting a private audience with Matteo the janitor, a request that sent shockwave through Valerius's office. Matteo, bewildered but gentle, received them in a small parlor, offering them the same humble kindness he had shown the Pope. The delegates, accustomed to grandiosity, were visibly moved by his unassuming grace. They spoke of the Pope's example, of the profound lesson in humility they had witnessed. This was a direct, almost surgical strike at Valerius's carefully constructed image of authority and importance. Monsignor Alaric, seeing the shift in the ecclesiastical winds, began to subtly distance himself from Valerius's more extreme positions, adapting his rhetoric to align more closely with the prevailing sentiment, though his ambition remained undimmed. A few days later, Pope Leo XIV convened an unscheduled press conference, an unusual move for him. The press room, usually filled with cynical journalists and hardened photographers, buzzed with an expectant energy. Cardinal Valerius and Monsignor Alaric were conspicuously absent from the front row, having chosen to send lower-ranking representatives instead, hoping to maintain a degree of distance. The Pope, seated at a simple wooden table, not a grand podium, began his address by speaking about the concept of community. "My children," he began, his voice calm and clear, "the Church is not a pyramid of power, but a tapestry woven from countless threads, each one essential, each one precious, each one contributing to the strength and beauty of the whole. If we forget the worth of a single thread, if we dismiss the quiet labor of those who maintain the fabric, then the tapestry itself begins to unravel. He then revealed something that truly stunned the assembled journalists and those watching live around the world. In the days since I shared a meal with my dear brother Matteo, the janitor, I have been deeply touched by the outpouring of stories from countless others. Stories of unsung heroes, of overlooked acts of kindness, of dignity found in the most humble of vocations. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. And so, I have decided to institute a new tradition within the Vatican. Every month on the Feast of St. Joseph the Worker, I will host a meal. Not in the grand dining hall, but in the staff canteen. And for each meal, a different member of our Vatican staff, a cook, a gardener, a guard, a cleaner, a driver, will be my honored guest. We will share a simple meal, and more importantly, we will share our lives, our stories, our humanity. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Journalists began furiously scribbling notes. Photographers' cameras flashed in a blinding flurry, and a palpable wave of emotion swept through the room. This was not a one-off act. It was a systemic change, a deliberate reorientation of the Vatican's internal culture. This wasn't just about Matteo. It was about every single unseen worker, every quiet contributor. It was a profound statement about the Pope's vision for a more inclusive, more compassionate church. The cynicism that often permeated the press room evaporated, replaced by genuine admiration. Cardinal Valerius, watching from his television in his private study, felt a cold dread settle in his heart. This was not a challenge he could simply dismiss or denounce. This was a fundamental shift in the very ethos of the Holy See, orchestrated with quiet precision by a man he had so utterly underestimated. The Pope had not merely broken tradition. He had redefined it, reshaping it around a core of radical compassion. The first of these new monthly meals was a quiet affair, deliberately kept away from the immediate glare of the media, though stories and grainy photos inevitably leaked. The Pope sat with a young Swiss guard named Klaus, who had always dreamed of serving the Holy Father but found the day-to-day duties mundane. Over simple pasta and water, the Pope asked him about his family in the Alps, his hopes and fears, and the unexpected moments of spiritual insight he found in the quiet sentinel hours guarding the apostolic palace. Klaus, stiff at first, slowly relaxed, finding himself speaking with an openness he never thought possible with the pontiff. The Pope listened, just as he had with Matteo, affirming the guard's quiet dedication and service. He spoke of the sacred duty of protection, of the silent witness to history, elevating the everyday to the divine. This nascent tradition quickly began to reshape the internal dynamics of the Vatican. The once rigid lines of hierarchy, while not erased, began to soften. Guards stood a little straighter, cleaners hummed a little louder, cooks seasoned their dishes with a renewed sense of purpose. A quiet buzz of anticipation now rippled through the staff each month, wondering who would be the next guest of honor at the Pope's table. It fostered a sense of community, of shared purpose that had been largely absent before. The Vatican, often perceived as a cold, bureaucratic fortress, began to feel more like a large, albeit complex, family. The Pope, through these simple, consistent acts, was weaving a new kind of tapestry within the ancient walls, thread by humble thread. The shift in atmosphere was subtly destabilizing for Cardinal Valerius and Monsignor Alaric. Their traditionalist allies found their arguments against the Pope's populism increasingly difficult to articulate to a public captivated by the Pope's authentic humility. Valerius, a man who thrived on predictable order and clear lines of authority, found himself navigating a landscape that felt increasingly fluid and unpredictable. He saw younger priests and seminarians openly expressing admiration for the Pope's approach, a shift that threatened to undermine his own influence within the Curia. Monsignor Alaric, ever the opportunist, began to praise the Pope's prophetic vision in public, while privately expressing frustration to his confidantes about the sentimental excess and lack of proper protocol that he felt was slowly eroding the Church's traditional strength. He found himself caught between his desire to climb the ladder and his genuine ideological discomfort. One afternoon, Matteo was quietly sweeping a seldom-used corridor when he heard the familiar soft swish of the Pope's cassock. He straightened, instinctively preparing to step aside. But Pope Leo XIV stopped beside him, his gaze falling upon Matteo's old, gnarled hands gripping the broom handle. "Matteo," the Pope said, his voice gentle, "I wanted to thank you again. Your willingness to share your table, your stories. It has opened a door within these walls that was long closed. It has allowed me to see the heart of this sacred home, not just its grand facade." Matteo, deeply touched, could only manage a choked whisper of "Your Holiness, it is I who should thank you. You have given me back my voice." He looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears, and for the first time the Pope saw not just a janitor, but a man renewed, revitalized, imbued with a fresh sense of worth. This brief, quiet encounter between the Pope and the janitor was witnessed by a junior priest, Father Anselm, who was hurrying through the corridor. Father Anselm had initially been among those who had quietly snickered at Matteo's public humiliation. He had been a fervent admirer of Cardinal Valerius, believing in the strict hierarchy and rigid adherence to rules. But seeing the genuine affection in the Pope's eyes, the quiet reverence with which he treated the old janitor, something shifted within him. It was a profound, almost spiritual jolt. He realized the vast chasm between the cold, intellectual arguments of tradition and the living, breathing compassion exemplified by the Pope. The scene, so simple yet so powerful, chipped away at his ingrained assumptions, planting a seed of doubt about the path he had so confidently chosen. The monthly dinners continued, each one adding a new layer to the unfolding narrative of Pope Leo XIV's papacy. He dined with the gardener, Benedetto, learning about the cycles of life and death in the Vatican's secret gardens, and speaking of the patience required for spiritual growth. He shared a meal with a young, shy seamstress who mended the vestments, and discussed the unseen artistry that contributes to the liturgy. He listened to the stories of the cooks, the drivers, the archivists, each voice adding to his understanding of the Church's vast, interconnected body. These interactions became his true classroom, his source of wisdom, far more profound than any theological treatise or diplomatic briefing. The ripple effect was undeniable. Visitors to the Vatican, hearing the stories, often sought out the staff canteen, hoping for a glimpse of the Pope's new, informal approach to leadership. It became a quiet pilgrimage site, not for grand miracles, but for moments of authentic human connection. The public perception of Pope Leo XIV soared. He became known as the People's Pope, a leader who not only spoke of humility but lived it. His homilies, once seen as intellectually dense by some, now resonated with a simple, profound truth that touched hearts around the world. The image of the Pope breaking bread with the janitor became iconic, printed in newspapers, shared across social media, inspiring countless acts of kindness and humility in communities far removed from Rome. Churches began hosting their own humble meals, inviting local service workers, the homeless, and the marginalized to break bread with their clergy, fostering a renewed sense of community and empathy. It was a grassroots movement, born from a single, spontaneous act of papal compassion. Cardinal Valerius, however, felt increasingly marginalized. His pronouncements on theological purity and hierarchical order seemed to fall on deaf ears, replaced by a yearning for genuine connection and compassion. He saw the Pope's actions not as spiritual leadership, but as a dangerous erosion of the Church's gravitas, a capitulation to a secular world that valued sentiment over substance. Monsignor Alaric, ever keen to adapt, began to openly express admiration for the Pope's popularity, carefully framing it within a traditional understanding of papal authority, but never quite abandoning his underlying ambition. He was learning to navigate the new landscape, recognizing that the old ways of climbing the ladder were rapidly becoming obsolete. The Pope had not engaged in a shouting match, but had simply walked a different path, a path so undeniably true to the gospel that it rendered the opposition irrelevant. One particular event solidified this transformation. A large, international interfaith conference was held in Rome, drawing leaders from across the globe. During the final address, Cardinal Valerius was scheduled to give a speech on the importance of interfaith dialogue and the preservation of religious traditions. He prepared a meticulously researched address, filled with historical references and theological complexities, designed to impress and assert the Vatican's intellectual authority. However, just before his scheduled address, Pope Leo XIV took the stage. His appearance was unannounced, a departure from the printed program. He simply stood at the podium, his gaze sweeping over the diverse assembly of religious leaders, scholars, and journalists. "My brothers and sisters," the Pope began, his voice calm and clear. "We gather here to speak of dialogue, of understanding, of the traditions that bind us, and the differences that sometimes divide us. But let me tell you of a dialogue I have learned to cherish deeply in these recent months, a dialogue that transcends creeds and titles, a dialogue rooted in the simple act of breaking bread." He then recounted, in plain, heartfelt language, the story of his meal with Matteo and the subsequent monthly dinners with the Vatican staff. He spoke of the lessons he had learned from the janitor, the cook, the guard, lessons of resilience, of quiet faith, of the profound dignity found in honest labor. His words were simple, devoid of academic jargon, yet they resonated with an emotional truth that captivated the entire audience. He continued, "The true dialogue, I have come to realize, begins not in grand halls of debate, but in the humble sharing of our humanity. It begins when we see beyond the robes and the titles, beyond the doctrines and the dogmas, and recognize the divine spark, the shared dignity in the eyes of every person, regardless of their station. For in that recognition, we find the common ground upon which all true understanding, all lasting peace must be built." As he spoke, the camera, were this a YouTube production, would have panned across the faces of the audience. Cynical journalists leaning forward, furiously typing, hardened diplomats wiping away a tear, religious leaders from vastly different traditions nodding in silent agreement, their own spiritual convictions affirmed by the Pope's simple message. This was not a lecture, it was a testament. When the Pope finished, the applause was not merely polite, it was thunderous, an outpouring of genuine admiration and heartfelt appreciation. It lasted for several minutes, echoing through the grand hall. Cardinal Valerius, standing in the wings, his prepared speech clutched in his trembling hand, watched in silent agony. His meticulously crafted address, meant to be the intellectual high point of the conference, now seemed utterly irrelevant, a relic of a bygone era. The Pope had not directly rebuked him, had not even mentioned the controversy, but had simply demonstrated, through living example and humble storytelling, the true meaning of spiritual leadership. His arrogance was not crushed by insult, but by a grace so profound, it made his own rigid adherence to form seem hollow and spiritually impoverished. Monsignor Alaric, standing beside Valerius, felt a profound shift within himself. He saw the raw, emotional power of the Pope's message, its ability to transcend intellectual arguments and touch the universal human heart. He recognized that the path to true influence lay not in cunning and ambition, but in authentic connection and a genuine embodiment of the gospel. For the first time, he felt a flicker of something akin to genuine humility, a recognition of his own superficiality. He looked at Valerius, whose face was a mask of defeat, and understood that the old world they had so fiercely defended was irrevocably changing. The story of Pope Leo XIV's break with tradition became a defining narrative of his papacy. It was told and retold, not just as an anecdote, but as a parable of leadership, humility, and the true meaning of faith. Matteo, the janitor, though still humble, lived out his remaining years with a quiet dignity he had never known before, a beloved figure in the Vatican, a living symbol of the Pope's transformative message. The staff canteen became known as Matteo's Mess Hall, a place where the spirit of community and shared humanity truly resided. Cardinal Valerius, though he never publicly apologized, gradually retreated from the public eye, his influence waning as the Church embraced a more compassionate and inclusive direction. Monsignor Alaric, conversely, began to subtly change his approach, his sermons softening, his interactions with junior clergy becoming more empathetic. He started advocating for more outreach programs, for greater transparency, slowly, authentically, embodying the changes he had once resisted. The events in the Vatican resonated far beyond its ancient walls. They sparked a global conversation about the nature of leadership, the importance of valuing every individual, and the true meaning of service. It was a reminder that genuine power lay not in towering hierarchies or rigid adherence to protocol, but in the courage to strip away pretense, to acknowledge vulnerability, and to extend a hand of genuine human connection to the least among us. Pope Leo XIV, the man who had been underestimated, had shown the world that true authority was not about enforcing rules, but about embodying love, about inspiring transformation not through grand decrees, but through the simple, radical act of breaking bread with those who had been overlooked. It was a lesson for all times, a testament to the enduring power of compassion and integrity to reshape institutions and touch the deepest parts of the human soul.